I want to welcome you all to this Strategic Foresight for Sustainability Project's public webinar that is now opened. So we have today two sessions that we are going to go through in this webinar. So my name is Toni Alkvist, and I'm a professor of future studies in Finland Futures Research Center at Turku School of Economics, and I have been running the work package 2 and gathering an amount of interviews. And in this presentation, first, I'm going to give an outlook on key results and about how we are going to report our results also. So first, about the program of this webinar. We are going to have a 45-minute session on key results of the interviews that we have been conducting in the project, and then something about how we are going to report them. And during the presentation, you can give comments, you can give a sort of feedback, mostly and preferably in the chat. So I have a couple of questions that I would like you to reflect on during the presentation, and I will go through them in a moment. In 9:45, we are going to have a 15-minute break, and after that, we are going to go to the second session of this webinar, which is about work package 3, which has the title Describing Co-Development Projects and Rounds of Feedback, and it will be facilitated other partners in the project. And after that, in 10:45, we will have some time for discussion, closing words, and some reflection if you want to present questions. And with the work package 3, there will also be instructions on how it will be done later when this second session will be starting. About this public webinar, our aim is firstly to present the results so far of the quite massive amount of interviews we have been conducting. We have been doing over 130 interviews, focus groups, and webinar discussions on a topic of sustainability, digitalization, and foresight capabilities in European organizations. That's the first part of the presentation, to get a perspective on key insights for you, on key points, and also to gather your perspectives on what insights you find particularly important, particularly interesting, and what kind of gaps maybe the data contains also. And the second part is to catalyze the formation of co-development projects that is continuing on top of this interview analysis. So we have discussions facilitated by Design School Golding, HMKW, University of Applied Science for Media Communication and Management, who are running the work package 3. So about this project, the acronym SF4S stands for Strategic Foresight for Sustainability. It's an Erasmus Plus project that is running between 2022 and 2025. We have several research partners, and it also includes several industry partners. You can have a quick outlook on research partners down below in the figure. Project is run by Design School Golding, and we have industry partners from 3 clusters. So basically, we are studying companies in agri-food cluster. We are studying companies and products in mobility cluster, and also in health cluster. And what we are emphasizing is how foresight capabilities can be catalyzed in these organizations, and how digitalization and sustainability are endorsing the formation and catalysis of foresight capabilities in the organizations. And we also have the aim of constructing new future-oriented courses and curricula in universities and educational institutions, especially in the field of strategic foresight. So the aim is then to catalyze foresight capabilities in companies and organizations through construction of specific curriculum, specific educational programs and courses. So this is basically the project in a nutshell and what we are doing here. So since last autumn, we have been doing quite intensive round of interviews in different phases. So we have had 9 research partners conducting the interviews, and so far we have reached quite an amount of interviews of 133 interviews in total, of which some 90 interviews are direct face-to-face interviews done by different partners. And then we have had several face-to-face focus group sessions, which included 24 participants during November in Lille. And then we have had a webinar that had 20 industry partners that was run in January 2023. So we could say that we have quite a big amount of data, qualitative data, semi-structured interview data on which to present these results on, and with which we are still basically analyzing. So this is kind of like research in progress so far, and we are going to present our final results in June in the synthesis report that we are going to finalize. But so far this webinar now presents the results that we have been gathering on this amount of interviews. And about the perspectives that I want you to reflect on, or I would like you to reflect on if you have some insights, because I think that you could still share some important input for our analysis. I was thinking about 3 main questions that could be interesting, that are worth of reflection. So firstly, when I'm now going through quite a lot of results, quite a lot of insights that have been raised in the interviews. Firstly, I want you to reflect on the question that what do you find particularly important in these results in your perspective? That's the first question. So what is interesting? What is something that you would build on? What is something that maybe you have found out in your daily practices, in your industry, in your professional activities? That is the first question. And the second question is about what do you think that is missing in the analysis? Of course, we have a lot of data. We have a huge amount of different kinds of data sets that we have been producing from the interviews. But I think that all data gathering processes might have also gaps. So there might be something that is missing from the analysis. There might be something that we have not been able to identify from the analysis. So if you find some crucial gap that exists in the data, that would be very important information for us, and we would really like you to share it with us, so we can consider it and maybe also construct some practices around studying this issue further. So key gaps is another thing. And then third point is that we are of course interested in matters of future here in the analysis, and we have been trying to do as future-oriented analysis as possible, as future-oriented questions, as future-oriented discussions. But still, there might be that some emerging issues that are worthy of investigation might not be analyzed in the process. Emerging issues can also be called weak signals. So some kind of issues that are rudimentary, but are developing in your perspective and are developing in fast pace. And you see that these are issues that should be included in the analysis, even though they might not have come to our knowledge yet, or they are such an rudimentary issue that they might have slipped our perspective. So I think that this is the third question. So important points from your perspective, key gaps and key weak signals or emerging issues. And please put these on chat, and we can return to them in the discussion session in the final section, if possible. We can also deal with some of them already in this session if there is time left, but if presentation takes the most of the time, then we are just going to deal with a couple of issues. So it depends on how much perspectives there is now to be produced in the chat. So this is sort of the interactive part in this first session. So if we wrap up the key results in the interviews, we have been interviewing quite a few players in agri-food sector, mobility sector, in health sector. We have been also having interviews with the futurists, consultants, policy experts, and educational experts. So we have kind of quite wide-ranging knowledge about core domains of our research, but also we have been trying to cover up some of the contextual knowledge that comes from policy experts, educational experts, and futurists. If we wrap up some perspectives in the interviews now, the first thing is that what seems to be quite clear is that foresight is evaluated as the key emerging capability in, you can say, almost all interviews that we have been discussing. So practically all interviewed companies depict that they are building foresight capability in one way or another. Some are more into methodological perspectives and really trying to find out new methods to be applied. Some are really on sort of more basic level and just finding out how to integrate foresight in their practices. Some are more finding about scenario analysis, so alternatives to the strategic planning and how to integrate future alternatives in their planning practices. It seems that foresight is a key emerging capability across these domains that we have now been researching. And one key sort of synthesizing perspective is that there seems to be specific interest in two kinds of approaches. First is sort of evidence-based or data-driven approaches. So approaches that utilize big data, massive amounts of data and real-time data, and build different kinds of foresight perspectives, even forecasts based on this data. That seems to be something that is especially in mobility sector and in agri-food sector very much appreciated. Then the second is scenario-based approaches, so widening up the future perspectives and opening future horizons, perhaps more than sort of basic strategic planning processes are commonly practicing. So evidence-based and scenario-based approaches seem to be most cross-cutting approaches in the data. And then if you wrap up the massive amount of interviews that we have been gathering, you can find out that there are different kinds of competences that we call meta-level competences that are sort of cross-cutting most of the interviews in these three domains, so agri-food, mobility, and health. So first perspective that is highlighted is the question of multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. So more and more companies reveal that they are needing multidisciplinary experts and expertise that builds on multiple perspectives and maybe multidisciplinary teams. And this goes also with transdisciplinarity. So perspectives that cross scientific disciplines and are sort of joining different kinds of scientific disciplines are very much on the rise. A second key point that is quite crucial in future studies and foresight practices is, of course, systems thinking. So systems thinking is a second meta-level competence that we have identified across these interviews. So thinking about business domains in relation to other kinds of business domains, what kinds of systems are important, what kinds of sets of actors, what kinds of linkages these actors have, and so on. This kind of more coherent and synthesizing perspective seems to be something that companies are increasingly interested in and increasingly valuing. Third point is quite interesting, and especially from the perspective of a university professor like me, is a notion of critical thinking. More and more it seems to be that also inside companies and organizations, some kind of critical perspectives and assessive perspectives are valued. So being able to assess the perspectives of knowledge that you are gathering, what kind of perspectives it has, what kind of maybe value basis it might entail, and so on, and being able to think about critically these kind of different sources of information are especially important nowadays. And I think this is quite interesting when combined with systems thinking and this multidisciplinary. So it highlights quite much this ability to think alternatives to the present situation and business as usual, so to speak. Of course, digital capabilities were assessed to be highly on the rise, especially what Gathered mentions were analysis, management, and visualization of data. So different ways to manage the use of data, and different competences in visualization of data were assessed as very important across these domains. Connected with systems thinking and critical thinking is understanding wider context of activities, and this also resonates quite much with multidisciplinarity. So how to assess multiple contexts, multiple meanings, maybe multiple value bases of different industrial domains and societal use contexts is very important in the future, perhaps very important already now for companies and organizations. Then a couple of more sort of wrapping up type of competences. So one could say that there are some interesting rising social and cultural competences also mentioned in the interviews. For example, communication skills, organizational capabilities, especially in networking, but also what are the most interesting, at least from my perspective, are these kind of novel narrative skills. So a lot of companies mentioned in the interviews also that increasingly experts should be able to narrate their expertise and their professional domains in multiple ways, to be able to explain the products, the questions they are working on in different contexts. So this requires something that we have now here labeled narrative skills. And also another set of organizational competence that was very much on the rise was emotional intelligence and empathy. So being able to understand the atmosphere of the company, atmosphere of the organization, and being able to adapt these narrative skills also in the context of this sort of emotional atmosphere of the company. I think it's quite important skill, especially in our web-based working culture and increasingly virtualizing working culture, that when you have face-to-face meetings, you are able to somehow to read this emotional atmosphere of the meeting also, and not just be active behind the screen. I think this is something that is not necessarily directly coming from companies' daily practices anymore, if most of the workers are working in virtual formats. So this is very interesting rising competence. Then one that was mentioned in different forms are different kinds of novel literacies, which we have here just labeled new literacies. There were, for example, data literacy, information literacy, algorithmic literacy, sustainability literacy, and of course, for a futurist like me, futures literacy is quite interesting. But I think in general, what this means is that we need a lot of new skills in reading our changing environment and increasingly virtualizing environment, and we need to be able to contextualize signals that we get, and that is also very important rising competence in the working life. So this is on foresight capabilities and skills. Yeah, and then there was a question about how different foresight methods were utilized in these three clusters that we were analyzing. I think the use of methods had some similarities, especially when it comes to agri-food and mobility sector. So in agri-food sector, they're utilizing quite common foresight methods such as pestle analysis, steep analysis, horizon scanning, and what was quite cross-cutting methodological feature in analysis is that everyone nowadays seems to be interested in scenario analysis. So scenarios are after 60 years of practice, so to speak, in futures field, have now really gone through in last 3 or 4 years or so, because mostly of the changes in the operational environment that we all know of. What was also quite highly mentioned in the clusters was some sort of emerging issues analysis, and especially firms were contemplating that they should be including some sort of weak signal analysis, some sort of wildcard analysis in their strategic toolkit. But at least so far, a lot of the companies seem to be working that what could be the right method, what could be the right approach to actually include this kind of more speculative, maybe more emerging issues in strategic analysis. It's not very easy to include sort of issues that are on the rise in strategic landscape that analyzes, you know, strong signals, strong trends, strong trajectories in the operational environment. Road mapping was also one sort of more from the standard toolkit. Agri-food had one sort of speciality that there seem to be companies that are tracking in social media platforms and getting signals out of that. That was also quite interesting sort of speciality in the agri-food sector. In mobility sector, there was more talk about, for example, trend and technology radars, quantitative market forecasts, and different kinds of methods that use real-time data in their practices. And this might be the case that actually mobility sector has a lot of sources which produce sort of real-time data like traffic information and this kind of information, and for example, weather forecast in different parts of the traffic system and so on. So they have a lot of sources that produce real-time data. A lot of companies and organizations build their foresight practices around this kind of data that is collected in real time. Also in mobility sector scenarios, road mapping were mentioned. And there were a couple of interesting methodological sort of specialities that they mentioned. one was about assessing tipping points of different sorts of data. So trying to understand what kind of system transitions could be approaching when reading the data, and also images of the future was one thing that was mentioned as a method. In the health sector, the case was a bit different. A lot of the interviewed sort of experts were saying that foresight is not actually systematically utilized inside the health sector that much. Maybe it is utilized in health sector strategic practices and strategic planning, but in sort of continuous way in the health sector, it seems to be that foresight is still a quite much emerging issue. A lot of interviewers said that actually they are building on evidence-based, even number-driven planning quite much more than strategic foresight currently. But also some mentions were also that few experts are interested in trend scanning, but it is more based on this kind of personal interest and on a personal level, so to speak. So there are big differences in these sectors when it comes to foresight practices and use of foresight methods systematically. If you talk about future possibilities in digitalization, as foresight capabilities, also digitalization and sustainability were perceived as critical opportunities in all clusters. Firstly, they were seen as mutually reinforcing. Especially digitalization was assessed to be particularly important in building communities. And what was also coming to the interviews, that there is a need for continuous education and training at all levels in order to utilize digitalization for sustainability in a constructive way. What also was sort of like synthesizing perspective on interviews is that there seems to be a need of change of mindset on how digitalization is perceived in different domains. There was also quite a few notions that mentioned that could this be a generational issue? It might not be just a generational issue, it might be also a systemic issue, but there are levels that are about the user generations also, but there are also dimensions that deal quite much with the systemic aspects of the different domains, that there could be systemic blockages, systemic hindrances that hinder the use of digitalization in these different domains. One cross-cutting theme is to utilize digitalization, of course, in data analytics, especially evaluation of real-time data according to sustainability parameters. Third cross-cutting theme is virtualization of planning processes. Increasingly, virtual sort of planning process was perceived very important in different domains, and also this link with these continuous approaches. So a lot of interviews were wondering about how to make strategic foresight more continuous part of their organizational practices. Then our third domain was about sustainability and innovation practices. Basically, all interviewed companies and organizations mentioned that they are more or less doing multiple sustainability practices in one way or the other. And sustainability was perceived as the key driver of innovation, and that was quite much a consensus perspective, I might say. Four common themes that are identified. So firstly, using digitalization for sustainability, especially through different kinds of digital platforms, such as digital market platforms, as in agri-food sector, or a digital sort of real-time traffic analysis type of platforms, for example, in mobility sector. Then second point, that where sustainability and innovation practices meet digitalization is measurement and assessment, like life cycle analysis. Third way is to increase traceability and transparency across value chains, and that was mentioned several times as very important part of developing different industrial domains. And then, of course, one major theme of our time developing circular economy and bringing circular economy into sort of practical level of companies. I think circular economy was in a lot of interviews mentioned as a big strategic perspective, but there is also differences how circular economy is then applied practically in sort of floor level, so to speak. And this is where the difference come mostly to the fore. We have also quite a lot of cluster-specific results. Of course, now I presented some of cross-cutting themes in foresight capabilities, in digitalization and sustainability practices. If you look at, for example, agri-food, and we analyzed quite much in the interviews of the future possibilities, future challenges, dimensions of both digitalization and sustainability, and also sustainability and innovation practices. And I think that most of the interesting differences in results are these cluster-specific results. For example, in agri-food sector, there was quite a lot of talk about understanding certain root causes of how agriculture is operating, like critical role of photosynthesis and biodiversity issues and so on. So this is kind of like the starting point for understanding sustainability questions in this domain. Then there are movement, of course, from meat protein to plant-based proteins. This kind of like direction that agriculture is currently going. New production modes were mentioned, so local vertical farming, even lab-grown food was discussed. And then what digitalization enables is this novel form of digitalized food companies. So digital platform to sell food products and also to network around certain food ideas and food ideologies even. Future challenges that were cross-cutting the domain of agri-food sector. One is what is here named climate change paradox. Is that we currently have less land that is suitable for farming, but then there is constantly more need to produce food more and more. So we need combinations of different kinds of production modes. So this traditional agriculture, but also this kind of vertical farming type of practices, and also even these lab-grown practices need to be catalyzed in the future. So it was very much assessed that climate change causes this kind of need for diversifying agricultural practices. Of course, one that was mentioned as a worry in agri-food sector is disinterest of younger people to work in agriculture, that is changing the face of the field. And of course, different big drivers, megatrends even in society might affect. So geopolitical transition, like war in Ukraine, that has quite practically affected agri-food sector in multiple ways. If you take a brief look at sustainability and innovation practices in agri-food sector, a lot of talk was about certification schemes, that they are good drivers of agricultural sustainability innovation, like organic fair trade, rainforest alliance, and so on. Also, this digital collaboration and trading platforms were perceived as important possibilities. And in agri-food sector, especially the traceability of products was seen very important, and especially traceability of products across different value chain actors. So being able to trace the root of the product to the level of the farm, that was seen as very critical in the future. And also one interesting was that actually what could catalyze also the interest of younger people in the field would be to sort of sharing of different kinds of transition stories in the field. So how agricultural field has renewed, or what are the possibilities of, for example, digitalization in the field. So there is this image of bit old-fashioned local production that might not be that much of interest to younger people, and these transition stories was perceived as one way to maybe solve this dilemma. Then there are, of course, specific challenges in sustainability and innovation practices. So how to get novel foods accepted by society and different regulation in more fast track. That was one sort of critical hindrance in the system. What kind of funding structures there are, and also how to advance green transition and in practice in farm level and also in value chain. And then the fourth one was cultural barriers for plant-based food. So there are still a lot of societal structures that hinder the use of plant-based production and foods in society, which are mostly cultural and not necessarily regulatory or political. Some cluster-specific results of mobility. Future possibilities are quite much building around digital possibilities, around such concepts as virtual planning, digital twins technology, real-time measuring data, flow management, optimization, interoperability, multimodality, and so on. So smartness comes through both in infrastructure of mobility, but also in the nodes of mobility or vehicles of mobility in cars and different kinds of mobility devices that we are currently utilizing. Transparency of value chains was also assessed as very important future possibility to show that where do these raw materials come from and how different, for example, cars are manufactured from different resources and so on. And one that was mentioned across different interviews was open data ecosystems. So increasingly there is a need to have this kind of open data-based foresight systems and open data-based digital solutions that different mobility players can utilize. Future challenges, there was also quite interesting ones. So one was the age and culture gap between decision makers and mobility users. So maybe this comes to what kind of vehicles and what kind of infrastructures mobility users might be ready to utilize, but then regulation is always something that seems to be a bit lacking behind. Also, we have, especially in the built infrastructure, we have a lot of so-called legacy systems that do not enable the use of technologies in that way, and old infrastructure. Diverse regulation in different countries is hindering the use of digitalization across mobility sector. And then there was, in several interviews also I mentioned that actually these ongoing parallel transitions of electricity, hydrogen-based mobilities and automated vehicles, they are kind of like enabling each other, but they are also sometimes hindering each other. So there might be this kind of too much parallel transition ongoing that it's hard to grasp this kind of features. In sustainability practices, mobility sector has a lot of so-called sustainability events already. So conferences, seminars, dialogues. They have different kinds of models to tackle sustainability aspects, and life cycle assessments in plural seem to be very much on the use. So they are very much building on this real-time data and system data already. And especially open innovation platforms that utilize this open data were perceived as important opening in this perspective. Challenges are of course, when there are parallel transitions ongoing, a lot of different systems, a lot of digital solutions, price and lack of understanding among customers. So there might be a bit too much digitalization also ongoing in order to really take full benefit out of all of the systems. And also, few interviews said that demonstrating the actual impacts of sustainability is pretty important. So where and through which kind of solutions the sustainability is actually reached, and in which mobility context, different sustainability practices work, and so this kind of more contextual sustainability knowledge was also called for. Traceability, I also mentioned, and one that's quite interesting is so-called footprint thinking. So how to sort of measure the impacts of mobility sector in different kinds of footprints. So not just of sustainability, but also on different kinds of evaluation schemes. And in health sector, the future possibilities start mostly with the idea that there should be more long-term thinking and cultural and mentality change in the system. So more like in the systemic level, and through this cultural and mentality change on how to utilize digitalization, then digital solutions could really have an enabling effect in the system. And what were practically mentioned in all of the interviews were AI-based analytics and different kinds of optimization of already ongoing logistics, like in health system and hospital surroundings. What is a challenge in the system that was mentioned practically in all interviews is the lack of time among healthcare professionals. So that seems to be a quite universal problem in different countries in healthcare system, and also knowledge gaps between solution planners and the actual users in the system, like doctors and nurses who are using these systems are not really communicating in same level with solution planners. How to train health professionals, and also this is quite permanent perspective that there is a very thick regulation in the pharmaceutical industry, which is hindering and making experimentation and new innovations very expensive. Current innovation sustainability practices are networking meetings, internal projects. There is quite a lot of practical circular economy initiatives in hospital sector, test labs, and also different kinds of initiatives for mapping ecological footprints of a hospital. And then what are the challenges is how to catalyze these system changes, how to make this cultural and mentality change, how to get communication, involvement, leadership, and how to embed these digital approaches in the hospital and health system context. That is perhaps the one key to enable digitalization in the health sector. Okay, now I have presented quite significant overview of our results, both these cross-cutting teams and also these cluster-specific teams. And how this now continues is that we are, of course, in the project, we are going to make a synthesis report that is going to be finalized in June. And we are having also a couple of presentations that I just now market. First is in the ISPIM Innovation Conference. We are going to have a session and also a presentation about these SF4S results. And also one presentation will be in FFRC conference, which is to be organized in next summer, entitled Empowering Futures, Long-Term Governance, Democracy and Futures Research. So this is how the working progress will then continue. And with these words, I want to thank you for your attention, and we might have a couple of comments still that we were able to answer. Thank you. Let's see.
Yes, please. There have been many questions and discussion on the chat. Main comments. I can contribute with questions. Mainly about the gaps in one issue was about data management in organizations, for example, and how data management could be better utilized. And of course, organizations develop their own specific methods and approaches, but maybe that has been noticed that's been a bit overlooked.
A good comment. So about organizational data management practices, I think this perspective was pretty much the core that was discussed in health sector, that they should have like very embedded type of digitalization approaches. Good point.
And another question would be about the value chains. It would be interesting to consider localization, particularly production and resilience.
Yeah, that's good point. Also, I think especially in agri-food cluster, the localization seems to be quite much the starting point that where analysis should start, and also to be able to sort of trace the roots of the product very carefully and pinpoint these localized sort of starting points. Let's take just one more and then we perhaps wrap up.
Yes, there was very many questions.
That's good. Thank you.
The detailed comments and thank you for everyone who gave those. I think the one other issue was on the mobility needs need to be connected to energy transition as well as the ongoing urbanization. I think that was quite interesting.
Yeah.
Point to link these to a wider picture of energy use and maybe there's kind of some parallels between these.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is something that comes through these interviews, that this systemic thinking and how actually different changes affect different systemic contexts should be somehow grasped, and for that maybe we need some kind of analytic and visual tools also, and need to develop different kinds of ways to visualize and present these different parallel changes ongoing in different systems. Thank you for all your comments. I think we now need to get 15 minutes around a break, and then we will come back at the second session of this webinar. And I hope that you all stay in the web and be ready to continue this interesting session. So thank you.
All right, so welcome to the second part of our session here today. Now we will introduce you to the work package 3, which is about the co-development project. We from HMKW are leading this work package, which is Samrina Jaffrin and myself. And yeah, to give you a little bit of background again, why we initiated this whole project actually, and in particular the co-development projects, which are one or maybe the essential part of that whole project, are basically 4 observations that we picked up. First one, industry needs for futures literacy and accessibility of foresight methods. So we saw that these foresight methods are available, but somehow they are complicated and difficult to utilize within the organization, to translate them really into daily practices. And our question was, how can we promote futures literacy in organizations and mainstream the utilization of according methods? And our response to that is the co-development projects, leveraging some good practices that we found in the literature and also already being practiced in some organizations. We observed a neglect of values and normative future scenarios in comparison to the more widespread exploratory scenarios, especially in innovation management. So that was the reason why we decided to combine both approaches, exploratory and normative scenarios, in the co-development projects. Third one is the need to integrate currently distributed efforts to manage future scenarios, sustainability and innovation. So if you have a big organization, oftentimes all these activities are located in different departments. Scenarios are maybe dealt with in the strategy domain, sustainability in the CSR department, and then you have a unit for innovation management or even just research and development. And there oftentimes are only just loose connections and not a strong synthesis of these activities. And our question that we derive from that, how can we integrate these currently distributed efforts to manage scenarios, innovation, and promote sustainable development? That's why we decided to start with some great or grand challenges that are valid across different stakeholders and organizations in the 3 clusters we already mentioned. And the fourth and final observation is the need for advancing green, digital, and foresight skills in higher education and professional development. So the question here is, how can we enhance green, digital, and foresight skills among students and innovation professionals? And through this project and the co-development projects, we are just creating like new industry cases and trying to make these methods in order to create them more accessible to a wider audience. So the initial setup of the different partners here was that we have one academic partner, namely HMKW, leading the mobility cluster, EDEC, leading the agri-food cluster, and Design School Kolding, leading the health cluster, with the associated industry partners. Based on the initial discussions we had, we decided to make the mobility cluster kind of a one work stream as it was initially planned, but to kind of combine the activities in the agri-food and health cluster, because especially the industry participants from these 2 clusters articulated like a strong interest also in the other activities of the other clusters. So this is the new setup. We'll have 2 work streams, one focusing on the mobility industry, one focusing on agri-food and health, and accordingly quite soon we will jump out into different breakout rooms. So those of you who are more interested in the mobility issues can join us here in the mobility cluster and have a look into what kind of methods and approaches we pursue in order to create these scenarios and to work with them and to bring forward especially the issue of future business models and that domain, whereas the others more interested in the agri-food and health can join that breakout room. And what's important for us is that at 10 to 11 Central European time, we try to get back into the plenary and have a final wrap up of today's session here. So, yeah, this is time for here the organizers to allow us jumping into the different breakout rooms. So you can self-select which room you want to join into, and yeah, then we will follow up with the activities in there, have a little discussion, and then come back 10 to 11 Central European time.
Welcome back to the main room. I think also most of you also from the mobility cluster is back now and so on. So could we just have a, like you're all back from the mobility cluster, Samrina?
Yes, yes.
Great. Okay. We just have a little bit of a time here to wrap up some of the things that we maybe discussed in each room. So maybe the mobility cluster, could you just say a few things what came up at your end?
Yeah, sure. So we looked a little bit into what we're planning here in the co-development projects. We looked into the methodology to build on existing exploratory scenarios in the domain, to then move on to the normative scenarios and the road mapping activities. And yeah, we kind of gave a sense of what we're intending to do here, right? Especially with extraction of business implications from existing future scenarios on mobility, right? And we discussed a couple of examples that are already out there. We discussed a scenario of like green pricing or more like a universal internalization of external costs, so to say, into business activities. And we took that as a starting point to come up with ideas from the audience. And we had, I think, quite fruitful discussions. We had some people commenting that we should further look into business-to-business domains, as well as one important domain that there is an important aspect on systems or ecosystems, because a lot of these sustainable services, if you think about repurposing or sustainable business models like repurposing, they cannot be offered by one market player by itself. Or intermodal mobility and green pricing, that was another example we introduced. Yeah, we had some interesting discussions around, say, changing mindsets and customer expectations about sustainability. For instance, if with regard to air travel, and you know, some airline associated companies are part of our consortium. And we also heard about like little incentives that business are giving to their customers. For instance, I think there was an example even here from Turku, where you can go to if you arrive to a shop with your bicycle helmet on, they give you a 15% discount. So I mean, these little incentives that can also help to raise awareness and create some positive contributions that are actually not that are actually baked into the business models of the organization, right? So I think I think we had a quite nice discussion around some of these aspects here. Maybe some of the participants from that contributed want to add something that I may have forgotten here.
Okay, but it seems then just write it up again in the chat. We can also say from the food and health cluster that we had also some very nice inputs and so on in the discussion here around had we actually, for instance, considered end users in the beginning, also in the interviews and so on. NGOs to participate maybe later on or in from the beginning as well, and so on. So a lot around the participation, and also the combination of food and health was the main discussion we had in our breakout room. And I think it really gives us something to just reflect upon, and then say, are there something here we should do differently or add to the things we are doing right now. So that was really great, and thank you to all the participants for jumping in on these discussions and so on. We do have time for one, maybe two really burning questions. If you really want it now, then please write it in the chat or raise your hand, because it's now we have the opportunity. So we'll just give a second for you to do that. Otherwise, we will just give the last information here. Is there anything from the chat? No. I'll just give it 10 seconds, so you just have the chance to just briefly, and then we'll just say a couple of last things here. Okay, I think mostly we have been around to it and so on. So thank you very much for taking part of the discussions here and so on. There's been some questions also in our breakout room with the food and health cluster on how can I participate in this, or how can I be part of this as we go along. On a very general level, we want to say that in general, we have a lot of these open sessions, and these influencing parts from you is really great for us to have. And so if we can keep on having you as key influencers to the project, we really would like to invite you all the time for these open sessions. We also have at the EASPIM conference this summer in Ljubljana, we also have some sessions around this. So consider joining this conference, because it's also a very nice city and some very nice content on this conference. And we might also consider here to open it up in the fall. We'll have to discuss how we can do that and so on for more influencers like you in this one. And if you are really interested in the co-development projects and so on, you can send an email to the cluster leads here, and then we can discuss what makes sense for us and you in this. And the last comment is that instead of it's actually written into the project here, and part of the next step here is that for each of the interviews and summaries we have around that, we are going to create some briefing documents. So it will come like in a 5 or 6 pages that every one of you also will get access to when that is ready in some weeks. So that might be better than actually giving you the slides, because there you would have it in a very fine and last overview in these briefing documents. So that's also a follow-up we will give to all who signed into this webinar. Thank you very much for today. I think that was the last word from our end, and thank you to all the co-leads here and so on, and for moderating this session, and have a nice day at your end. Thank you very much.